After the fall of the Assad regime, the European Union says it wants to see a Syria-led process of transition, chiefly on the principles of stability, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. But the new government should also take into account the rights of minorities and women. Hannah Neumann, who is a Green MEP here in the European Parliament, just came back from Syria. We caught up with her. You just came back from Syria. So what did you observe? How is the current situation at place, and how is the country faring under the leadership of the Islamist Hayat Tahrir al-Sham group?
I went to Damascus mainly, so I entered from Beirut over the border to Damascus, but I made a deliberate effort to meet people from the different parts of Syria, be it from the Kurdish regions, be it from Aleppo, Homs, Idlib, all these places. And I think the overarching feeling was a duality of hope. Hope because Assad is gone, because people have the impression they can speak freely. Hope because they see a chance to really have an impact and a say in rebuilding this country. And at the same time, fear that this window of opportunity might be of a rather short term, and a concern of where this HTS that has been radical, that has kind of become a bit more normal, but might fall back to radical terms again, where all of this is going to lead.
Did you have any indications, because you meant that it might fall back to radical terms again? There have also been warnings by human rights groups that, especially with regards maybe to an inclusive approach, also for minorities, that this might be prove difficult. Have you experienced anything like that?
I would say it's too early to say. If we look at the language of al-Shara, especially his latest speech that he was giving while I was in Syria, he's ticking all the boxes of our expectations. He's saying free and fair elections at some point. He's saying national dialogue. He's saying participation of women. But what people desperately need, and I think pressure for this is mounting, is a concrete timetable. Because they also know the devil is in the detail. So kind of, okay, we say legislative council, but who will actually be the person sitting there? Will HTS be the guardian, or will they just be one part like many others? These will be the tricky questions that decide whether this goes in towards more democracy, or let's say a system where HTS is going to be in unlimited power and people will be consulted only. So it's like they hear the words, but they still doubt the actions. And we know this from other contexts as well, and I mean, many Syrians are quite experienced people, so they are not naive. HTS has been a military movement. HTS is from one sect only. HTS has its roots in a religious setting. And it is never easy for these groups to transform into an open, democratic, rather unhierarchical, deliberative modus operandi. And if we look at the countries around Syria and their developments after the Arab Spring, it has proven to be quite difficult to transition towards a democracy. So many Syrians are very, very clear that this is where they wanted to go, and they are willing to invest a lot, but they are also not naive, knowing that there are a lot of challenges ahead of them, and they don't know yet if HTS is part of the challenge or the solution.
You're a European parliamentarian, so I guess you also traveled there asking yourself, maybe, what can the EU do? And I would like to ask you that same question. What should the European Union do at place, in your opinion?
Syrians have been quite clear, saying that they want this to be a Syrian-led process. And this is also language that has been in UN Resolution 2254, a Syrian-led process. And I think this is the role that we should play. The challenge then is, well, what is it that the Syrians want? How do we find that out? And how can we then support that? And this is the process that remains to be seen. Where they have been all crystal clear on messaging is that the sanctions are a problem. They want us to keep the sanctions against Assad. That's quite clear. Many say you can also keep the sanctions on HTS until you see where they develop, but we really need to get rid of the sectoral sanctions. So sanctions on oil exports, because that is how they can make money for reconstruction. Sanctions on electricity, because they need electricity and we need to repair the grids, basically, to allow them to have electricity. Sanctions on finance, so that people can send remittances home without a problem. And here we clearly see the different timelines. I mean, HTS and his allies, they took Syria in only 2 weeks. We are discussing whether we should lift the sanctions or suspend the sanctions for 3 to 4 weeks, And now that we have a political agreement that we will suspend, we still need to discuss the technical details for time span unknown. And this is sometimes a bit difficult for Syrians to understand, because what they really need is economic reconstruction so that people can return from the camps and they can rebuild their livelihoods.
Let's maybe talk a bit about the sanctions, because as you mentioned, the EU foreign ministers have decided to pause them, but it remains relatively unclear what this actually means. Or would you have like closer insights, like which areas would be paused, when would this pause enter into force? So do you know what this means, and also what you mentioned that there is a certain frustration at place? How has this been transferred to you towards the sanctions?
So they are discussing on the sectoral sanctions, and the discussion is whether we suspend everything that isn't related to repressive equipment or arms deals. So when it comes to finance, this is part of the discussion. Electricity is part of the discussion. Infrastructure, also medical equipment. This is all part of the discussion of what should be suspended or lifted. So now my understanding is that there is an agreement that there should be a suspension, not a complete lifting of sanctions, meaning that we give al-Shara and his government the benefit of the doubt. So as long as we think it's moving in the right direction, we support with lifting sanctions so that you can also develop economically. But in case that things turn badly, we still have the option to basically bring the sanctions back in. Why it takes so long? Well, apparently there might be different considerations on how fast we should lift these sanctions when it comes to HTS amongst member states. With Italy, to my understanding, being more open, like let's just lift them all right away, and Germany and others being a bit more reluctant and trying to keep some of the sticks that we still have to ensure that HTS moves into the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, because as you said, it is the approach to like keep the stick, to be able to say if things are not going in a way that the European Union is wishing it to go, that they can then like put back on the sanctions, so to say? Did you get any impression that keeping that stick is necessary?
Given the assessment of Syrians and how other kind of transitional situations developed in the region, I think we have no other option than to support HTS if they walk the right way, because there's just HTS. It's not that we could pick a leader that we would like. It's just HTS is in power. We should now invest everything we can to make sure that they walk into the right direction, but we shouldn't take that for granted. So we should always be prepared in our policy, in our thinking, in our dealing with this regime, that maybe it might go wrong, and then we have to also react very fast.
The European Union is also still giving humanitarian aid to Syria. I think for 2025 it will be 235 million euros. You talked about the economic development. What do you think is needed there? When will the country be, or how is the situation at place for the people?
The humanitarian situation today inside Syria is the worst ever. So it is clearly needed that we continue to send humanitarian aid. There are still millions of people in camps. Whole cities are being bombed, so people can't return. It's unclear who owns their houses, who can return. All of this will also be a source of conflict in the future. So we need to make sure that we don't even intensify these looming conflicts by making people basically starve. So we need to continue sending humanitarian aid, knowing that the only medium to long-term way out of humanitarian aid will be economic reconstruction. So continue sending humanitarian aid, but also making sure that we support this country to coming back on its own feet, to generate its own resources, for example, through selling oil, and also supporting Syrians who are in the diaspora who want to go back and rebuild their country, because they will be most likely the most successful businessmen and women that this country can have.
Mm-hmm. For the economic reconstruction, do you see a role for the European Union, and do you think that the Syrian people you talk to wish for that?
Well, I mean, first of all, the European Union, companies based in the European Union have played a role before the civil war in Syria. For example, there is a huge German company that was responsible for the electricity grid. And the best option would be that now they can go back and just rehabilitate and maintain all these facilities so that electricity can come back. Then Syrians, they really like European quality. So they like German things, they like French things. So I think they see a role for companies to invest, to come back to Syria, to also help rebuild, streets, to help rebuild logistical infrastructure. All of that is something that Europeans are good at. It's kind of close, and we should really not underestimate the power, the economic power that lies within Syrians that went abroad to European countries, that speak the language, that they understand the system, that they are highly qualified, and that they now want to rebuild Syria, either by returning or by just having this bridge function. And here, I think the key role should be to ensure that our policies do not keep them from being able to do that, so that we can really lever the power that lies within these bridge builders, Syrians that came to the European Union and that now really strive to rebuild their country. And they will be a huge source of economic potential for Syria, but also for European-Syrian cooperation in the economic field.
Now, my understanding is that asylum seekers cannot go back to Syria because they would lose their status, or people that have been granted asylum, they cannot go back. Is there anything that the European Union can do in this regard? Because it is national law, or it is enshrined in national law. So what is your idea on this?
Well, I have been one of those that in week one said we need to have one discussion about migration that is allowing these people to temporarily go back without losing their status, because it would help us with the economic reconstruction. It would help us with the democratic process, because the Syrian democratic opposition mostly went to the European Union countries. And also when we think about voluntary return, you want to go back and see what it looks like before you bring your whole family. So with all of these things, allowing them to temporarily return without losing their status would just help, their situation, but also what we want to see. So we started the discussion, and at least when it comes to Germany, there has now been an announcement that Syrians who are not yet German citizens will be allowed to go back for 2 weeks without losing their claims. It's still a bit bureaucratic. Germany is always a bit bureaucratic, so they would have to inform, and then they can go back for 2 weeks, and maybe just going back once is not enough, but it's a start. What we have reached from the European level, and this is the kind of influence that also I myself have, is that the European Union clearly communicated to all member states this is possible. And it's in our interest, so please do it. And now I know for Germany, they are trying to implement it. I hope other EU member states will follow, because it's just in everybody's interest, and it's so nonsensical not to do it.
Maybe a last question, because there's also the question of the jurisdictional or the judicial roll up.
It's such an important thing to do.
Yeah, what do you see there? Is this happening? Does Syria have also the means to do this?
Sharai in his first speeches has spoken a lot about economic reconstruction and security, but I think it has become quite clear for him, and this has changed in his last speech, that transitional justice, so giving the country a chance to heal, will be crucial for success of whatever also he wants to do with it, but also for Syrians. The horror of Assad it's incredible. We still have between 100 and 2,000 people missing. More than 500,000 died. I was myself in Sydnaya prison, which is such a brutal. It's a machinery of sadistic killing, seriously, and it still haunts me until today. The few hours I was there with the former detainee, just explaining the procedures. And there will be no future for Syria if there are not ways and means to heal. Well, this was one of the topics that all Syrians asked me when I was there, was how did you do it in Germany? How did you do it after World War II? How did you do it after the Stasi? Also because there were these close links between Stasi and the security services of Assad. And what is quite clear, I think that the highest level, so Assad and the highest level, they will have to undergo some form of international justice tribunals. but then what do you do with all the other layers below? And there it really needs to have a national dialogue. To what level do we deal with them? What do we do with people who are victims and offenders at the same time? If we give, let's say, some kind of pardons for some lower level people, but we also need compensation for the victims. Otherwise, the ones get away and the others are still stuck with all their suffering and all their problems. So here, I really think it's time, and urgently time, to start a national dialogue of where Syrians, especially, former detainees or families of former detainees and missing persons, want to see this going. What we start seeing at the moment, and this is indeed a bit varying, is revenge killings. So, of course, sometimes you kind of know who tortured your son. And if you don't see a legal procedure in which this will be taken care of, I don't say I understand it, but still I do to some degree, that people then have the feeling they need to take things into their own hands, which is why we so desperately need a timeline and a procedure. And we also see that sometimes files where there's information on missing persons, or even people that worked for Assad that could have this information, they disappear. And it's difficult to understand for what reasons, but victims are very, very worried about that, because these are sometimes the only sources of information to find out the truth. Will Syrians be able to do that by themselves? Well, no.
Are there, so how does the European Union come in though? Are there any initiatives, maybe international justice initiatives that have been invited?
So, there are UN mechanisms that were set up to deal with this in the time where Assad was still in power. And Syrians are a bit frustrated how slowly they are adapting to this new setting, where they really should and can and have to work inside the country. We shouldn't double these efforts, but we should help them become faster, and I think see where we can complement that. One, by sharing the lessons from the European Union, what we did in Germany, what Spain did, what Romania did. We have so many examples in our own history. Also how you deal with that as a society in the longer term, how you treat victims, all of that. So here I really think we can come in with our expertise. And HDS and the Foreign Ministry has set up a unit where they now seek information from different other countries, also Guatemala. We have all these examples. So here I think with expertise to start with, to inform a Syrian process where then they make their decision on how they want to do that. And then again, I think we should come in with technical expertise. In Germany, for example, we know how to store all these files, how to digitalize them, how to open them to the public, and also the reference systems that were built up, for example, to detach the informant from the information in Germany. It looks pretty much the same than what Assad built up. So also here, just this exchange of knowledge. I really think we should work on that. And I'm in touch with the organizations in Germany who also really would like to support and play their part. And matching these two things is something that the European Union, and especially with their representation in Syria, could indeed do.
Ms. Neumann, I think we have to leave it here for today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your time.